Welcome to the Mind.
What do we really mean by genius?
Matters.
Giftedness is so much more than an academic label.
Podcast.
We tend to think of gifted as kids being good at everything across the board.
An exploration of giftedness.
Originals are nonconformists.
Creativity.
People who not only have new ideas.
Intelligence.
They're the people you want to bet on.
In childhood.
I like to learn about things, but I like to learn my way.
And beyond. This is the Mind Matters Podcast.
Hey guys, welcome to episode 29. Today we're talking to Dr. Kathryn Fishman-Weaver. She's the author of Wholehearted Teaching of Gifted Young Women, Cultivating Courage, Connection, and Self-Care in Schools. She's also the Director of Academic Affairs and Engagement for Mizzou K-12, which is a global school district with 7,000 plus students from over 100 different countries. We'll be talking about a fascinating study that she conducted and talk in general about self-care and emotional support in schools and beyond. We want to take a second to remind you that April is Autism Acceptance Month, and we're really busy on social media promoting the acceptance and understanding of autism. We'd love for you to join us by using an autism awareness hashtag. You can share your stories or experiences or learn more about the autistic community. If you aren't following us on social media, look us up. On Twitter, we're at Mind Matters Pod, and on Facebook and Instagram, we're Mind Matters Podcast. If you want to follow me directly on Twitter, I'm at EmilyKM_LPC. One more thing before we get started. We're getting new Patreon supporters every week, and we're really grateful. It means the world to us that people are supporting us as we continue supporting the gifted community. A $5 a month contribution on a credit card will really help us to keep the message front and center. To help out, go to patreon.com/mindmatters. Coming up next.
Hi, my name's Kathryn Fishman-Weaver. I'm an educator, a researcher. I'm the author of Wholehearted Teaching of Gifted Young Women, Cultivating Courage, Connection, and Self-Care in Schools.
Stay with us.
On a recent episode of Mind Matters.
The gifted guru, Lisa Van Gamert.
I was the typical gifted kid perfectionist, not wanting to play with toys, but rather just organize them. I watched an episode of Hoarders with my husband. The woman being interviewed said, "Well, I'm a perfectionist." To my husband, that made no sense whatsoever. How could she be a perfectionist? And I understood completely, because sometimes perfectionism manifests itself in this complete throwing in of the towel.
Would you say that perfectionism is inherently a negative quality or a negative trait to be overcome? Are there instances where it can be viewed in a more positive way?
So you've asked the most controversial question among academicians researching perfectionism.
That's episode 6, available at mindmatterspodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts. This is the Mind Matters Podcast.
Our guest today is Dr. Kathryn Fishman-Weaver. She conducted a qualitative study that led to the publishing of her book, Wholehearted Teaching of Gifted Young Women. This study examined gifted teen girls at the high school level and the social and emotional support that would allow them to realize their potential. So, Kathryn, before we jump into the study, why don't you give us some insight into your background and what led you to do this study?
I had just taken over the role to chair a gifted education department at a large public high school. And as I was getting ready to transition into that role, the previous chair pulled me aside and said, as we're planning for next year, I want you to know that our greatest need is a group of 8 students. And I knew these 8 students. They'd all taken an advanced placement English course that I'd taught. And I really pride myself in culturally responsive teaching and getting to know my students. And so I felt like I really knew these kids, and I was surprised that the previous chair was sharing this was our greatest need. So I explored that a little bit with her. And as it turned out, this group of 8 young women, they were all young women, were presenting with a host of concerning social emotional needs. And these were pretty rapidly reaching crisis levels. So we were seeing things like depression and anxiety. We were seeing some self-harm behaviors. We were seeing disordered eating, unhealthy relationships, tough and scary stuff. And as a school, we were all pretty shocked. How had we missed this? And so my first immediate need stepping into the role was to, number one, address this and to make sure that these young women were safe and had strategies that we could work through this together. And then number two, figure out how had we missed this and how could we be proactive going forward to help prevent other similar crises? And so these sort of three questions, how do we help young women heal when they're in this state? How had we missed it? And how can we prevent it going forward became the basis for my research for the 6 years that I served in the capacity to chair this department, and then are the story of the book.
I noticed that as I was reading your book, one of the things that you talk about and kind of really address is people think that gifted kids are going to be okay, which, we'll talk about a little bit more. But I think the other thing that kind of struck me was talking about that terminology as it's related to gifted. I know for me, I typically use the word high ability. That's kind of interchangeable for me. And you talk about using the word high achievement. Why do you feel like that's important?
That's a great question. So I think a lot about language, and I think that all of our language is imperfect. I think that giftedness in particular is a loaded term, and some of the ways that it's loaded are problematic. So one, I think the term to a lay person really masks affective or social emotional needs. When we hear that someone is gifted, we think, oh, how wonderful for them. They have all of these gifts. And we miss a lot of the needs that go along with that term. We also know that we haven't done a good enough job of identifying gifted students of color, low-income gifted students, 2E students. And so many people have been left out of this label that I also feel is incomplete, that's problematic. And so the term I use in the book is high achieving, because what I was really talking about with this particular group is how are social, emotional, or affective needs intersecting with high achievement and with achievement culture. So with this high stakes, high stress culture that we're seeing across schools. And so that was the term that I felt like got closest to what we were trying to talk about. Then when we talk about achievement, if we're not spending enough time talking about that intersection of achievement and well-being, let's start that conversation now, and using that term gave us a place to start.
You talked about some of those underrepresented groups sometimes that might not qualify for that label of gifted. I know a lot of people who maybe are working in the schools and teaching gifted kids. They may not have a high school program at all, but your district did, and you used an open classroom model. So tell us a little bit about that.
We had an open door resource room, and my philosophy was that any student who wanted to access our gifted services, and so those included access to the resource room where students could study, could collaborate, could socialize, could play games, could come and see me to access counseling services. So I did college and course counseling, and then I ran the social emotional group as well, ran book clubs. We ran a service project out of the gifted resource room that was really exciting. We had kids serving in 12 different organizations. We ran an internship program where students could intern all over our city. So my philosophy was anyone who wanted to access those services were welcome. Mm-hmm. And so I remember talking to an administrator about this kind of as I'm stepping into the role, and they said, well, Katherine, what if 500 students show up and want to access these services? And I said, if we have 500 students at our school who want to access gifted services, that's a terrific problem for us to problem solve together, and I'd be happy to help you with that. Mm-hmm. We didn't have 500 students in the room at any time. We did have a lot of students in the room, which I saw as a really beautiful thing.
So going back and talking about this group of girls who you really found needed some additional support, and you talk about the framework that you used to kind of structure that support and how you were very influenced by the work of Brené Brown. She's one of my favorites. And so I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how you set up the work with these girls.
Sure. It's a great question. So I'm a huge fan of Brené Brown's work. I think that she sort of speaks truth directly to my vulnerable soul. When we identified that first group of girls, the students were in crisis, and we were all in crisis about this too, right? How could we make sure that they we're safe and okay as quickly as possible. And so when you're in crisis, you're not super strategic. So I reached out to literally anyone I could think of who could maybe give some wisdom or counsel to me. And I went to a school counselor. We had an amazing school counselor who does self-care work with faculty, staff, and students at our school. And I explained to her the situation, and she gave me Brené Brown's book, The Gifts of Imperfection.
That's one of my favorites.
Oh, it's so great. And she said, Katherine, just go read this book. It's gonna help get you on the right path. Mm-hmm. So I read the book, and it's absolutely applicable to this conversation. And then I started reading just all of her work that I could. So as I'm reading Brené Brown's work and finding tremendous truth in it, and it's impacting my teaching and research practice, I want to share the work with the students. So we studied Daring Greatly together, and the students found lots of wisdom in Daring Greatly, but said, this feels like this scholar is speaking to teachers, to parents, to adults, right? Mm-hmm. We need to create a theory that's speaking to students, that's about youth experiences. And so we set out on this longitudinal study to create a theory that is informed by the lived experiences of young people. And where we end up is pretty similar.
Yeah, I think part of the reason that Brené Brown's work really kind of resonates with me is because working with high ability kids, the concept of vulnerability, that's a very big part of her work. And I feel like that's a very big part of what sometimes holds those high ability kids back.
Absolutely. So in the first couple of years of the study, I would say that was my biggest takeaway from running this group. So we ran the group in year 1 with the 8 young women who I mentioned. And then part of the work was, how can we be proactive to try and remediate this crisis before it presents at this level? And so we ran groups every year. And in those first couple years, the vulnerability of the students who participated in this group was astounding and inspiring to me. So we would sit around a table together, usually with food, and the young women would share difficult and honest stories about their struggles and their challenges. And they did so at the beginning with some trepidation, because these aren't conversations we have enough in the world and in schools in particular. But every single time that the students would engage in this vulnerable story sharing, it was met by deeper connection to others in the room. One young woman would share a story, and someone across the table would say, I thought I was the only one. I can't believe you've experienced this too. Here's what it's been like for me. And I watched for 2 years this concept, this idea of vulnerability, of disclosure, how it was fundamentally changing the classroom community that I was participating in, and I was fascinated by this. I felt like we were onto something really big, and how could we make more space to have these conversations and facilitate these connections? Kind of became the last 4 years or so of the study answering that question.
As you were kind of getting started, and then through your book, you talk about a masked affective crisis. Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about what that term means to you and how you were noticing it manifest.
When the chair shared with me about this group of young women, and I was sort of stepping into the role, that I was surprised and that our school was surprised. And I think there's a lot of mythology around high achieving and gifted young people that says these are our school superstars, right? So there are valedictorian hopefuls, there are national merit finalists, there are presidential scholar nominees, there often are varsity athletes, they're often first chair in their bands and orchestras, and we cast them as these superstars, and that's really problematic. We're creating this mask, this superstar mask, that says you have it all together, when no one does, because we're all human, we're all imperfect, we're all works in progress. And what we're masking are the affective needs, the social emotional needs of this particular group. And kind of the only way in this construct to get adults and to get others to notice is for these things to present in crisis, as we saw in year 1.
Is there a difference in kind of how high ability girls face some of these things that you're talking about, these different social emotional needs, than even high ability boys?
I think it's a great question. It's a question that I've been asked a lot lately since the book's come out. So this first group, this group of 8 young women, we're addressing immediate needs. And so as we're exploring together our social emotional realities, gender and identifying as a young woman was a really important part of that. And we talked about gendered pressures in that first group, and then I continued to run the group for young women every year after, so we experienced a lot of success. We had important conversations about gender. So we would talk about the microaggressions that the young women had experienced in STEM programs and STEM competitions. So one young woman that I worked with, her name is Michelle. She often won STEM competitions, and repeatedly, when she was called to the stage, the announcer, not knowing her, would call Michael to the stage. I worked with a number of young women who were on the debate team, and they talked about a feeling they had that was when their young men counterparts were confident or assertive, they were rewarded. And when they were confident or assertive, they received criticism for being too aggressive. So we had these conversations. We had conversations about body image and all of the different messages students were receiving in school and through the media and how that impacted them. We had conversations about athleticism. So I worked with a lot of student athletes. And what did it mean to be a student athlete and to be a young woman? And so all of these conversations are about gender, and they're specific to young women identities. And then we also talked about how gender is a social construct that's also highly individualized. So what it meant for one student to be a young woman was different from what it meant for the student across the table from her to be a young woman. And so we explored all of this, and it was important. And there wasn't another place in school where the students were really doing this. And so sometimes the boys would say, hey, what about us? We want a group too. Sometimes there were specific young men who said, I need that group. And those are the people that I'm friends with, actually. And so we had one young man one year who attended several of our sessions. And then in the later years, as I continued to hear this from the guys in our resource room, I said, let's try it out. And so we had a few sessions that ran parallel. So I would do a session with the young women on a theme, and then the next week I'd run a session with the boys on the same theme. And the conversations were so similar between the two groups. It was really impactful for me as an educator. So I heard across groups, it's really hard to make friends. I heard, I don't know what this dating thing is all about and how I'm supposed to do that. I heard it doesn't always feel cool to be smart. I heard that everyone has all of these expectations about me, and they didn't use the term imposter syndrome, but that's what they were talking about, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't know that that's true. I faked my way into the gifted program. I faked my way into AP classes for my whole life. And so these conversations, these are the same. And much like the young women, the young men didn't have a space in school where they were exploring these things. And much like the young women, it was so impactful for them to hear someone vulnerably share with them, and across the table, someone says, oh my goodness, you too? I thought that was just me.
Yeah, definitely. I heard one of the themes that you said came up a lot during those groups was the difficulty they would have making friends. I hear that theme too with my clients, that there's this feeling of isolation or difficulty connecting. What were some of the things that you heard from those kids that resonated with you?
I think this is one of the most important takeaways for parents or teachers from this study, actually. Most of these students had known each other for most of their lives. So it wasn't uncommon that these girls, started studying piano or violin together when they were 3, that they'd participated in ballet together in elementary school, that they ran on the city track program, that they'd been in the gifted program in elementary, taken honors courses in middle school, were now taking AP courses together in high school. And I, incorrectly, assumed that they were also friends because of this, right? That somehow, organically, all of this proximity with each other had led to real relationships, and I was wrong. And the students told me that. And they said, no, they said, we don't have time for friends, one. And 2, we don't even know why it would be important to make time for it. And then if we did, we don't know how.
Right.
This is super powerful. And again, as I said, surprising to me. And so at the end of the study, I interviewed the last focus group. I interviewed each of the young women individually. And I said, what was your biggest takeaway from this study? And unanimously, every one of the young women said the most significant takeaway for them was that they now had a friend group and that they understood the importance of a friend group and that that hadn't existed for them before our group. This is huge, and I think speaks volumes to teachers certainly, and also to parents, that proximity doesn't necessarily equal connection, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as we think about the young people in our care, how can we be sure that they have a peer group where they can share openly and honestly? We've talked about kind of the benefits of that vulnerability, of learning that you're not alone. How can we create spaces and then invite and bring young people into those spaces so that they can develop these relationships? I think is a really, really important question.
You write that when these study participants got to college, it affected the way they approached socializing there too. What did they do?
They looked for opportunities to find a friend group, and they said, I don't think I would have done this otherwise. So they looked for organizations that they could join. They made time to get to know new people on their college campuses. They met for lunch. They engaged in service work together. And they say that this had a tremendous impact on their college life, and I'm sure it does. But how much time do we spend in schools teaching kids about the value of friendship and how you do that?
Yeah. Reminder that we were talking with Kathryn Fishman-Weaver. And Kathryn, you wrote a book called Wholehearted Teaching.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you tell us about the concept of wholehearted teaching?
So the research that I do is called youth participatory action research. And the idea of youth participatory action research is that you don't do research on student communities, you do research with student communities. And so all of the young women who participated in this study worked alongside me as student researchers. And I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about how can we democratize research, and also how can we use research as a social emotional support for young people. So the students in my groups found a lot of agency and leadership being researchers. Often students' only experience with research is in their science class, right? So they approach research from a very quantitative, positivist idea. And so, but they wanted to know things like, well, how are we going to graph our findings? And so, I engage in mostly qualitative work. And so we talked about the idea of multiple right answers and narrative as data, but we couldn't let sort of the math connection go. And so there's this math theme that runs throughout this very qualitative, story-rich narrative study of how can we conceptualize this? And so what that meant, as I was working with students, we often talked about things existing on a continuum, and that was a really helpful construct for us. So one part of the continuum we've already talked about a lot in this conversation, and that's vulnerability. So one main circle of wholehearted teaching is the idea that vulnerability is really important. And so vulnerability means honest disclosure. It means being able to speak your heart when you're unsure of the outcome. If we put vulnerability on a continuum, we talked about the other side of the continuum being guardedness. So when I'm vulnerable, I'm open, I'm honest, I'm disclosing, even if I'm unsure of the outcome. And when I'm guarded, I'm playing it safe, I'm being careful, I'm being cautious, I'm making choices where I'm pretty sure of the outcome. The next one is high achievement. And the students from the beginning said, I'll work with you on this project, but I want to still continue to be a high achieving individual. Like, this isn't going to affect my grades, right? Like, I can still take all these AP classes. And I said, well, we're going to deconstruct that a little bit together. And so at the other end of the high achievement continuum is this idea of low achievement. And for us in our study, low achievement meant work that didn't challenge you, that you felt apathetic about, that maybe felt redundant. The next construct is self-care. So self-care we defined as intentional decisions to reduce stressors in your life. At the other end of the self-care continuum is self-harm, and talk about a loaded term. We couldn't come up with the opposing force without using that term, and so we spent a lot of time, again, exploring the idea that continuums exist, and the fact that a continuum exists isn't bad, isn't good, it is. And then the last circle in our 4-circle Venn diagram is this idea of strength. And so we talked about strength as being associated with agency, right? So I am in control of my situation. I'm able to make decisions for myself. And at the other end of strength is this idea of being limited. So I'm not in control of my situation. I'm not getting to make my own decisions. I don't feel like I have agency over this.
So those are the 4 main circles, but almost as important, I think, is the overlap areas of the Venn diagram. Why don't you tell us about those?
So what's the magic that happens when you both feel strong and are able to practice vulnerability? And we called that courage. What's the magic that happens at the intersection of high achievement and self-care? So when you're doing challenging work and you're also taking care of yourself, and we borrowed Brené Brown's term of healthy striving. So that's when we saw things like passion projects. And so this gave us a really rich construct to talk about a lot of different things that were happening in our lived experiences.
So if you were to use the results of that study and make a list of suggestions for teachers and parents, what would they be?
What I would say to teachers and parents in light of this study is first to practice courage. Courage was a guiding theme throughout our study. And so that looks like speaking your heart, even when you're unsure of the outcome. And I think that parents and teachers can be really important role models in courage. And I don't know that there's a lot of talk about how to do this. And I think that when we role model speaking our heart, when we're unsure of the outcome, that courage becomes contagious. And so we can create more of those safe spaces for young people. I would say be an active listener. So active listening requires intentionality. It requires removing all of the distractions. This is really challenging in schools. It's also really challenging at home. So I'm a parent as well. But there's no faster way to connect with another human being than actively listening. So I think that we have to commit to that practice. I would say young people don't have to wait to start making a difference. I talked a lot in our conversation today about the role of service and leadership as something that was both healthy for the students engaging in service and leadership, but also that was healthy for our broader community. So I would encourage parents and teachers to find out what your kids are passionate about and then help connect them to those things right now in authentic ways. And then finally, I'd end with connection, because connection's the glue that held this whole study together and that made our program work. And like we talked about earlier, connection doesn't just happen through osmosis, right? So we don't develop real friendships just through our proximity to each other. We have to create spaces where it's safe for students to be themselves and to share openly and vulnerably. And I'd ask teachers and parents to make sure that the young people in their care have those spaces.
Kathryn Fishman-Weaver, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thanks for having me.
My thoughts coming up next.
If what you hear on Mind Matters makes a difference to you and your family, consider becoming a supporter. Through Patreon.com, you can chip in to help defray the cost of producing this podcast. Just decide how much you'd like to contribute, and that amount will be placed on your credit card every month. Even a couple of bucks would help cover the cost of producing the podcast and help us promote it to new listeners who could also use our help. Go to patreon.com/mindmatters and become a patron. And thanks for making a difference.
I remember my high school gifted program. We were all shoved into a gifted English class, whether we were gifted in English or not. As diverse as our group was, we had high achievers and we had 2E kids. We had band nerds and drama geeks and athletes, honor roll kids. This class felt like home. Our favorite thing to do at the beginning of class was to get our teacher off topic, talking about something completely not even in the realm of what we were supposed to be covering. We could usually manage to use up a good 75% of the class this way. But in that process, we were vulnerable, and we supported each other, and we learned together. And now that I think about it, maybe our teacher had more intent in allowing that to happen than we realized. Imagine a gifted young woman that you know. Maybe it's a student, maybe your daughter, maybe even your own younger self. Does she allow herself to be vulnerable with others to create those true connections? Does she seek high achievement while also practicing self-care? If not, how are those things affecting her? We, as parents, as teachers, as counselors, we can provide the guidance needed for these young women to successfully enter adulthood. When we become active listeners, and when we value their experiences, when we make and encourage the space for storytelling of their lives so that they can build those connections, that's when we give them the room they need to blossom. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. See you next time on Mind Matters.
Grass is greener on this side. Are you ready for new? New beginnings, new pride. Let your spirit shine through. Many more come, many more under the sun. Pack your finest suit, and we will keep it steady. We will be the confetti, and if we fail, we just reboot.
The Mind Matters Podcast is on Twitter at Mind Matters Pod, on Facebook and Instagram at Mind Matters Podcast. Consider giving us a thumbs up and review, and we'd appreciate your help spreading the word to your friends. If you can, become a financial supporter at patreon.com/mindmatters. Mind Matters executive producer is Dave Morris, and our music is by Epidemic Sound. Our web home is mindmatterspodcast.com. Thanks for listening.
Yes, we will keep it steady. We will be the confetti, and if we fail, we just reboot. We just reboot.
I want to, let's see. We want to take a second to remind you that April is Autism Acceptance Month.
It's acceptance, not awareness.
Yeah, isn't that what I said? Maybe I didn't earlier.
Well, I mean,
it's both. We'd love for you to join us. We'd like to. Why don't I just start at the beginning? Is that okay? Okay. If you want to follow me, I'm on Twitter at Emily. I don't even know what my Twitter handle is. If you want to follow me directly,
can you give me that one again? Only like more awake.
So I know you really like that when I do this. So my thoughts coming up next. Okay.
Could you give me that one again? Only more like your mind is on this project.
My thoughts, because I'm very important and have many thoughts.
I have thoughts and I will give them to you.
And you will listen.
You will listen. You will be mesmerized by them.
I feel like there was too much between the favorite thing to do and then this about our teacher having intent.
Yeah.
We as.
Did you tap the table when you were
sorry.
Wow.
You think I can just edit anything you say magically, regardless of like how you read it, and it'll just like weave together like some? Am I the magic man or whatever? Mind Matters is a production of Morris Creative Services.